President Emmanuel Macron is hosting a financing summit for Africa today. Several African heads of state are in Paris, along with many EU leaders. The focus is finding ways to help African countries post-COVID-19. Officials say sub-Saharan economies alone will need $425 billion in extra funding over the next 5 years. France 24's business editor Stephen Caroll joins me now, not far from the Eiffel Tower, where that summit is taking place in Paris. Stephen, first of all, tell us a bit more about why the summit's happening in the first place.
The goal here is to try and limit the economic consequences of this crisis for African economies. Organisations like the International Monetary Fund have warned that these countries are going to pay a much bigger economic price because of the slump in economic activity we saw last year, Africa's first recession in 25 years, but also the slow nature of how recovery will happen because of that economic hit. They say that it will take, for sub-Saharan African economies, it's going to take 5 years for them to return to pre-pandemic levels. Compare that to the most developed economies in the world, which are expect to see largely a recovery by the end of this year. So what the leaders here present, who represent both African countries, some 21 of them here at this summit today, but also leaders of European countries and representatives of some of the countries who are the biggest lenders to these countries as well. They want to make sure that there is going to be financial support there to allow this economic recovery to happen. The goal here being is that as the rest of the world recovers, that Africa isn't left behind. What the message is from the international organisations is there can be no recovery from COVID-19 if everyone doesn't recover.
So that's the goal. What concretely is it hoping to achieve in the summit?
There are two strands that are being discussed. The French presidency is very keen on the idea that countries will be able to share some of their reserves at the IMF, what's called special drawing rights, with those countries that need financial support most. This is a proposition that, as the IMF is increasing its reserve of funding by $650 billion, that some of the member countries, those developed countries like France, will be able to share some of their special drawing reserves and give essentially preferential loans, but at very low rates, to countries that need it more, to pay for imports, for example, perhaps to fund medical necessities in the country, to allow them to access these reserves, which would be at much lower cost than trying to raise funding on the international markets. That's something that the head of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, told me in an interview this weekend that she does support the idea of, but it does require the members to agree to hand over these reserves, or to give, rather, to on-lend these reserves to countries that need it most. The other arm of what's going to be discussed is the greater issue of debt. There have been warnings for many, many years now of the dangerous level of debt that African countries are trying to deal with. The fear is that because countries are having to allocate so much of their budget to servicing their debts, that they're not able to use that for more urgent, pressing needs in terms of healthcare or economic recovery. And they want to make sure that that debt burden can be managed in a way that will allow countries to recover. That could be by extending a pause on debt payments that was put in place during the pandemic, or negotiating over a greater restructuring of how these debts are paid and who they're owed to. That's a process that's ongoing at the G20, but we're expected to hear talks about it here as well.
Stephen, thanks for that. France 24's Stephen Caroll, and we'll be checking back in with him throughout the day from that summit on African finance that's on now in Paris.